A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Can I just say that we particularly welcome Andrew MacDonald, who's our incoming General Secretary. Welcome, Andrew. Thought it would be a good idea for him to see how we behave before he takes off his post. Minutes.
Society Rankings of London, ordinary meeting Thursday, 3rd of March 2022. Cardiff, at the University of Cardiff and online. Professor John Hines, Vice President and Chair. The minutes of the previous ordinary meeting. Everybody up there in YouTube land. The minutes of the previous ordinary meeting of Thursday, 24th of February 2022 were read and signed. The certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society in order to be suspended in the usual manner. The following communication was then laid before the Society. Ruthin Castle, North East Wales, the medieval castle aiming to secure its future, by Fiona Gale, MBE. Thanks were returned for this communication. The Vice President announced the next meeting would be on Thursday, 10th of March, 2022, in Burlington House, and then adjourned the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as true and complete record? Following the results of today's ballot, I declare the following duly elected Fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of London: Efrosini Boucikas, Tim Bridges, Antonia Crisa, Anna Evis, Laura Gaskin, Elizabeth K. Foden, Ian Parkinson, Vernon Rapley, Richard Smalley, Sharon Stocker, and Gareth Williams. Certificates.
Thank you. I've got 7 certificates, and if I can remind fellows that I'm reading the shortened version and the longer version is on the website. Richard Allen, MA, MLit, PhD, Archivist and Records Manager, Magdalen College, Oxford, specialising in ecclesiastical history. Andrea Ogenti, MA, PhD, Professor of Medieval Archaeology at the University of Turin. Graham Barton, BSc, PhD, an archaeologist and Honorary General Secretary of the Bristol and Gloucestershire Archaeological Society. Dominique Bouchard, BS, BA, DPhil, Head of Learning and Interpretation at English Heritage. Tom Nancollas, BA, MSc, Conservationist and author of Sea Shaken Houses 2018 and The Ship Asunder 2022. Rebecca Roberts, BA, MLit, PhD, an archaeologist specializing in archaeobotanical analysis, especially in Central Asia. Robert Wenley, BA, MLit, Head of Collections and Deputy Director of the Barber Institute of Fine Arts at the University of Birmingham. Thank you.
Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? Thank you. Admissions.
The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, desires to be admitted a fellow. Sir Laurie Magnus.
We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to welcome our speaker, Professor John Bintliff, Emeritus Professor of Classical Archaeology, Classical and Mediterranean Archaeology at Leiden University, and an Honorary Professor at the University of Edinburgh. John studied Arcananth at Cambridge, did his PhD there, completing it in 1977 on the prehistory of human settlement in Greece. He subsequently been senior lecturer in archaeology at the University of Bradford, moving to Durham in 1990 as reader in archaeology, before being appointed to Leiden in 1999, where he worked until 2014. He's been a fellow of the Society since 1988, and since 1978 has been co-directing with my retired colleague Anthony Snodgrass from Cambridge, the Boeotia project, one of the biggest and most impressive interdisciplinary projects investigating settlement evolution in central Greece. John has published very widely, so it's great to welcome him this evening to talk to us on the Greek city-state on small scale, Hyettos, Boeotia, and its territory from 6000 BC to AD 1900. John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Martin. Nice to see you again after many years. And it's a great privilege to almost begin to talk to you. Oh, okay, that's just me. I think you might want to see the slideshow instead. Thank you. Yes. It's still a great privilege to talk to you and to those of you who are watching online. Since 1978, I have been co-director with Professor Anthony Snodgrass of the Regional Landscape Research Programme, the Boeotia Project, a province in central Greece, north of Athens. Using surface survey, alongside support from remote sensing techniques, collaboration with historians, and many other disciplines, we have researched 5 ancient cities and their associated countrysides. Our 2-volume final monograph on the city of Thespiae has already appeared. This lecture will discuss some intriguing aspects of our results from the survey of ancient Hietos city and its countryside in northern Boeotia. The city-state of Hietos controlled an upland plateau district composed of several adjacent plains and fertile hinterland. The yellow line marks the ancient state borders, and our intensive survey area is here in the northeast corner. This is a view of Hietos and its adjacent plain. And I think you can see why we worked in this rather nice place, apart from the archaeology. Apart from its archaic era Acropolis wall, the only monumental traces at Hietos are inscriptions built into that Acropolis wall, offering useful demographic data for the Hellenistic period, listing young citizens enlisted into its army. We field walked intensively the city and also several square kilometers of its plain and adjacent hill land. To reconstruct the story of the town and its countryside, we have our rural survey, where we see here the sites with their black survey grids and the colored off-site pottery densities. The city grid you can see to the south. And we also have numbered halos or impact zones around the individual rural sites. Here's an example of one of our rural sites, a Hellenistic to Roman villa, site CN6. And like Martin, we've benefited from drone photography, which is a wonderful tool to illustrate site locations. This is the density of ceramics across that villa site, going upwards to the red core of the site. And you'll see that that's also the core where we have from geophysics the villa plan, at least 60-meter long structures, complex structures underneath. And then quite a long history from the early Iron Age, peaks in the classical and also the later Roman period. We also have the city survey data. This is the collection grid from the city. The core of the city is represented by the higher surface contours, densities reaching up to 333,000 sherds per hectare. And we can reconstruct most of the city infrastructure with the aid of geophysics. This map shows the entire dependent countryside, or chora, of the ancient city-state. And as I mentioned earlier, the intensive area that we surveyed, plus the 4 early modern villages, Ardendri, Lutsi, Ravon, and Pavlo, 2 of which were deserted in the late 19th century. We should suggest that the linked upland basins, of which the Hietos district forms the northeastern part, might be conceived of as a settlement chamber or a Siedlungskammer in terms of historical geography. It's a region rather off the main and more fertile hill lands of settlement in eastern southern Boeotia. It's only moderately fertile, it's dissected in terrain, it could always support a modest total population, and one which needed to be dispersed around several foci, owing to the constraints of distance in farming this irregular landscape. Its rather remote location and its limited potential to foster wealthy communities and powerful elites conditioned its low profile in prehistory and history. And yet, for the prolonged period of Greco-Roman antiquity, when it was united into a single state, focused at Hietos city, its small scale is actually representative of a typical Greek polis or city-state, the normal polis, as the Germans call it. Also at heart, a Dorfstadt, a village state, as Ernst Kirsten insightfully described the polis in 1956. For many years, I have been applying the model for historical time analysis proposed by Fernand Braudel with its 3 parallel timescales of historical processes, the short, the medium, and the long term. I shall deploy this scheme to raise interesting issues of interpretation from our survey results at Hietos to try and create historical meaning. Let's begin with some long-term trends and cycles. Here is our estimate of population changes for the survey area at the city and in its immediate hinterland from the Bronze Age right through to modern times. And this includes the city population. And now we have the same demographic reconstruction for the wider area of the entire ancient city-state. Both of them show the same cycles of population rise and fall, typical for long-term survey data in the Mediterranean, with peaks in classical Greek, Roman to late Roman, and in the medieval period. let's look more closely at the individual cycles using the terms of the Annals Brodelian methodology. The Neolithic belongs to the long term. The few small rural sites occupy locations by streams or on very high water table soils, suitable for pre-plough agriculture, often described in Europe as garden hoe farming. But a small community at the city site sits on the Acropolis and seems to represent a district social focus, chosen for its defensive and perhaps ritual potential, being bereft of water and far from suitable farmland for contemporary technology. In the succeeding early Bronze Age, the impact of Andrew Sherratt's secondary products revolution is clear. The wider use of the ard plough and the wool and dairy products of domestic stock cause an explosion of farm sites across the landscape onto a wider range of soils and topography. But still focused on a small community on the city Acropolis. Let's now turn to the medium timescale of Brodel, the centuries. The most complex Bronze Age society regionally is that of the Mycenaean Late Bronze Age. The city site, however, remains only a minor district focus. And in the rural survey, there is surprisingly little evidence for a large population. Here we show the 4 parallel Bronze Age centers of the Hietos region. We have hypothesized that the scale of the Hietos prehistoric center was spatially very confined, with 3 small rival centers throughout later prehistory to its south and west. This was an inevitable consequence of the friction of distance. If traditional farming concentrates intensive cultivation in the landscape within 2 to 3 kilometers, or half an hour from residence, and a maximum 1 hour distance commute, there were large areas where exploitation from the Hietos Acropolis village was too remote. This anticipates by millennia the fragmentation shown by the 4 early modern traditional villages of our region. These 4 prehistoric foci were each small worlds, with local populations probably not exceeding face-to-face societies of 150 to 200 or so people. As such, they had to intermarry to remain demographically viable in the long term. Moreover, we have suggested that the Hietos small world may well have been, under contemporary technological levels, unable to support a much larger population, even by the Mycenaean era. All this may well explain the absence hitherto of elaborate burial monuments or a stone fortification in and around Hietos Acropolis, and the absence of any mention of the city in later epics. Only at the small world of Iosianis to the west, the predecessor to the traditional village of Lutzi, is a cemetery of Mycenaean chamber tombs attested, indicating that amongst this cluster of upland minor village foci, that was maybe the primus inter pares. Local dynastic competition must have favored this one settlement over the others. Let's turn to the next period, focusing on the medium-term demographic cycle, climaxing in classical times and declining in the late Hellenistic era. Our next case study then is the rise of the Hietos settlement to local dominance, beginning with the early Iron Age to Archaic eras. This begins with an expansion of the city over the early Iron Age, continuing through the Archaic era when it reaches its maximum borders. But rural occupation grows far slower in the early Iron Age and increases through the Archaic. But urban occupation really takes off in the climax of the classical times, when the city probably reached 2,000 inhabitants. And this is matched by intensive and unparalleled use of the countryside. Probably in the 4th century BC, after the destruction of the threatening regional power of Thebes, Hietos, like other Boeotian cities, replanned its lower town in a regular grid pattern, as geophysics has revealed. If we add our estimates for the now infilled countryside and the wider region, a city-state territory focused on Hietos, the demography of some 2,880 inhabitants is a suggestion which would exceed all levels, including the modern period. Such a population of almost 3,000 could not have been sustained from the Bronze Age small world of Hietos we previously outlined. So the explosion of the city population evidently marks the expansion to the full city-state of Hietos, to its classical boundaries. We have estimated the maximum possible carrying capacity of this territory at over 3,000 people. And even if we allow for villages and farms in both the inner and outer Kora, the abnormal explosion of the city itself to some 2,000 people represents several times the support capacity of its local hinterland. So this had to be supported by the explosion into the new outer territory. As to why the Hietos focus became the center of our settlement chamber when that had lain elsewhere in the Bronze Age lies surely in the world of short-term events and personalities, the timescale of événement in the Brodelian scheme of historical explanation, of competing families and competing centers. Freedom from the dominance of already existing more powerful states seems to be a precondition for such autonomous creations. But there were by now even larger, more precocious states to threaten the independence of such new minor city-states in Boeotia. By the later 6th century, the threat came from Thebes. And the rise of a populous small power at Hietos may have appeared as a hindrance to Theban expansion. We know of several interventions by Thebes, even in later archaic times, to claim a preeminent, controlling role in Boeotian affairs. And in some clash, perhaps in border territory, the two states came to war, for which a piece of armor dedicated by the victorious Thebans at Olympia bears witness. So the Hietos upland landscape was never a center of dense, concentrated population, and only once was it unified into a single state. Yet even this scale of polity, limited by local resources, could never be a power of importance within the Boeotian Confederacy. And for limited periods, it seems to have lost its independence to its much larger neighbor, Orchomenos. Indeed, it must be the case that overpopulation, already beginning in late archaic times, prevented any significant trading surplus to bring outside wealth into the city-state. So we hear disparaging remarks on its sites from Pausanias, the Roman travel writer. We have little architectural traces of major classical or Roman public monuments. The ceramic assemblage from the city also gives the impression of poverty compared to larger and certainly wealthier cities like Thespiae in both the classical Hellenistic and the early or late Roman eras. Imports do increase in the Middle Roman period when we have other evidence for a brief recovery of a more commercialized villa-based countryside. Hietos state controlled a district of 60 square kilometers, of which at maximum 30 were cultivable. And the city naturally benefits and reaches its greatest extent if only 16 hectares, while the survey area sees the most numerous rural sites and a majority of the off-site ceramics. So we're suggesting that the total population of the state, around 2,880 people, would give a 71% urbanization rate, extraordinarily high, and a figure of 86% of the carrying capacity of this landscape. Despite these low figures, this is well in the range of population and territory size the classical Greek cities. And these statistics from Ruschenbusch and Hansen confirm that. So Ruschenbusch pointed out that in the Aegean, 80% of cities have a population only between 2,000 and 4,000 people and about an hour radius. And Hansen, including the colonial world, has 60% with a 1 hour radius and 80% with, say, a 1.5 hour radius, very small territories indeed. And so Hietos fits very well into this small scale, what Kirsten identified as a Dorfstadt or a village state model. Such a high population could not be maintained in the long term, as agricultural specialists have pointed out, since soils cannot continue to be productive at this level of exploitation, while the typical climatic variability of the Mediterranean landscape is a regular threat. With the majority of its citizens living in the city, limiting the range of land where intensive commuter farming could be practiced, urban food supplies would soon become problematic. However, one other possibility emerged and was adopted on a massive scale in at least several Greek landscapes: intensive manuring from a city itself onto its most accessible farmland, documented by dense carpets of pottery. Here is the classical model of Tony Wilkinson from the Near East, where you see his argument that as population rises and the land is cleared, we can associate very often these very extensive field scatters marking urban manuring. And you see here the scale. We get up to our small towns of up the kilometer range from out of the city where we would find these great field scatters. It cannot be in the least coincidental that precisely in the period when Hietos reached its climax population in town and country, we have been able to date an unparalleled off-site ceramic activity, which we would claim to be manuring activity, and marked by these pottery carpets coating the first kilometer or so from the city. See the high colors, with less dense spreads at distances up to 2 kilometers out. And this is the actual dating of that material. According to authorities such as Robert Scheel, intensive manuring only delays an inevitable decline in soil fertility and hence crop yields when a high-intensity cereal agriculture is in operation. We have argued that at an earlier surveyed city, Thespiae, the dramatic shrinkage of the city by post-classical, late Hellenistic times arose in large part as a result of this ecological crisis. At Hietos, it is also with the late Hellenistic assemblage where we can see on the city map a definite retraction in the extent of the lower town, which will remain shrunken throughout the Roman era. It's the area that matters. The density is not a very good clue because middle to late Hellenistic pottery is not so well diagnostic compared to the classical to early Hellenistic. So the density is not key point. It's the localization that we shall see later as the city tends to abandon its western suburbs. Moreover, the remarkable series of citizenship records inscribed on the Acropolis wall has been read to infer a decline in population across the middle Hellenistic period, 200 to 160 BC, which agrees very entirely with our ceramic evidence. And we see also the rural contraction in the countryside, in the middle to late Hellenistic to early Roman. The blue symbol marks sites that now are either activity foci or non-residential places for farmers. And you see that the off-site activity has dwindled to almost nothing. Soil geochemical results provide intriguing support to the urban contraction. In the geophysics plan, notice particularly the anomalous pattern of the western city blocks, which seem to have very little content within these streets. Here are the sampling transects for looking at the geochemistry of the city over a number of years. Soil geochemistry reveals a whole range of human activity, from burials, graves, hearths, middens, houses, mining, general archaeological sites. And you see, unfortunately, that some of the same elements crop up several times over. So it has to be contextual when you try to read soil chemistry values. But I picked out some of the most striking patterns. Copper, lead, and phosphorus are typical of the so-called habitation effect, and they indicate prolonged and intense human domestic activity. What we see here is that the western suburb is relatively impoverished, with the yellow and green figures, as it saw only 300 years of urban occupation, compared with the 1200 years of settlement in the center and east of the city, with these high orange through to red figures, or these habitation effects in the geochemical symbols. In contrast, the local volcanic bedrock is very rich in nickel and cobalt. This shows us the very opposite, that in fact we're getting very high values in the western suburbs and off into the outside the city. And this shows us that these high values mark much thinner settlement deposits and much more subsurface bedrock exposure in the abandoned western suburb. Moving to the Roman to late Roman period. During this time, and this is from the survey area, which includes the city. During this time, the city is smaller, it remains smaller, whether we look at the early Roman or the middle Roman or the late Roman, it's a rather similar picture. Michaelis Karambinis has shown that throughout mainland Greece, innumerable towns shrink or disappear by early Roman times. So here we have the city map for the pre-Roman classical Hellenistic. The size of the symbol is the size of the city. And here we have the Roman imperial picture with many cities lost and a decline in the size of many cities. So our picture here, also from Thespiae, is very much of a large-scale phenomenon, extremely interesting phenomenon, deurbanization in the early imperial period, which doesn't improve over time. And there are very important and interesting reasons for this. And we see here in the countryside, by the Middle Roman period, we have fewer sites. Some of them are larger, and we interpret them as villas. And we feel that we're talking about here much more commercialized economy, but based upon a few larger estates, and perhaps the wealth not actually impacting the town, but being exploited elsewhere. And you see again, very little evidence for off-site activity. And the same goes for late antiquity, up to the 6th century. We have a few larger sites, villa sites. We have very little off-site activity with a much lower population. There is no need for intensive manuring from the city. Another sign of this commercial villa economy is a large number of very large presses, olive and wine presses, found at the city and in these rural sites. Let's move on to the medieval era. Here we have a medieval cycle, much smaller scale demographic cycle through Byzantine into Crusader Frankish. When the city declines in late antiquity, the remnant population moves to several small sites to the north, of which site CN3 will become the main settlement by the Middle Byzantine period. This is a photograph of the site with the two surviving churches for the village, marked with crosses. We see growth in this village over the succeeding centuries, the city at the bottom, and it reaches a climax around 1200 AD, at the end of the Middle Byzantine period. But the site continues on into the period of Crusader Frankish rule in the 13th to 14th centuries. But then we enter the Ottoman Empire. After the Ottoman conquest of Greece in the 14th to 15th centuries, at CN3, we see a reduced area in use, showing a population slump. A new medium-term demographic cycle is developing, that of the Ottoman Turkish period, the 15th to the 18th centuries, which appears as an overall decline era after the small climax of Byzantine Frankish times. The main part of this Ottoman era is entirely focused at our deserted village site, CN3, not far from the long abandoned ancient city to the south, with the population moving only in late Ottoman times to nearby site CN4. But for sure, these are not, despite survey appearances, descendants of the ancient city population. Our Ottoman tax registers show a total ethnic replacement. In the late 14th century, our region is depopulated, the Black Death, warfare between Byzantines, Franks, and the Ottomans. It's then recolonized by invited Albanians, creating the new villages of Vendre and Ravon, and the modern villages of Lutsi and Pavlo. On this map of taxed villages in the Ottoman tax registers, the refuge villages of Greeks and the two towns are marked in black, and the rest of the countryside is taken up by new Albanian colonists, small groups led by clan leaders. So you see here, in fact, Pavlo is Paul Muzak, and you see here that Lutsi is actually Andrea Lutsi. This is the clan leader who brought his people. Now the village is just known by the second name. And here are our four villages as they were founded in this period of 14th to 15th century as Albanian settlements. After this arrival, the next period of the early Ottoman age is one of great flourishing. The population booms, we have new settlements, all the settlements get larger. Through the 16th century, it's a time of great prosperity. Indeed, the Ottoman tax data show that the four contemporary villages, which now occupy our city-state territory, are anything but impoverished communities. And our Ottoman specialist Makil Keel presents a picture for CN3, Jin Vendre, John Vendre, I think it means John with a fat stomach, is the origin of our village. He said that in the early 16th century, the village could live almost entirely off its 620 sheep. But they also were producing wheat, barley, beans, pigs, beehives. And so Makil Keel concludes for our little community of CN3, in 1506, the villagers of Vendre lived well. They produced enough to sell a good part of the harvest to the markets of the town around them. Now this, for me, is a chastening reminder that we cannot read demographic cycles in simple terms of fluorescence and decline. And indeed, the greatest peak we've seen so far of classical times created an economic collapse. So this is a very low level population, decline, slump, but they're doing very well. The short term, the world of Brodelian événement. Our final case study is a short-term process focused on a curious transition which occurs in the late Turkish era, where historical events interrupt apparent continuities. This coincides with a general population decline in the Ottoman provinces, including Boeotia. This is the tax record of 1687, and you could see that the population has shrunk to a much lower level. By the 18th century, CN3 was deserted for a nearby plateau site, CN4. This is its location with the little chapel. This is an aerial view. This small survivor was abandoned as recently as the late 19th century, so that its standing houses and its plan fit the late Ottoman ceramics from our survey. The historic surprise is this translocation of the small Albanian settlement from CN3 to CN4, which the ceramics date to the 17th to 18th century. Why did this happen? We have reason to believe that our village of CN3, or Jin Vendre, passed into the hands of a powerful landowner. This is a general trend in later Ottoman times, when the central power became weak and formerly free villages were absorbed into the estates of wealthy individuals, the so-called ayan. The center of the state became weak and the regional landowners became more and more important. They began to absorb all the free villages. There's a chain of events which cannot be coincidence. It's associated with this powerful local magnet. In 1685, we see renovations of the chapel on the Acropolis of ancient Hietos, Aios Athanasios, with a new expensive fresco cycle, which may well have been upgraded as a memorial church for this elite family. Then around 1700, the village of Vendre, admittedly reduced to a fifth of its 16th century population, is gifted, we suggest, by this wealthy landowner to a distant monastery, together with the Acropolis church. As a result, the small community was moved a mere 20 minutes away to a new upland location, CN4, where it remained as an agricultural outstation or a metoki of the monastery till it was abandoned in the 19th century. In summary, the inner landscape of ancient Hietos itself, our survey districts, is not necessarily the natural center of our settlement chamber. In the Bronze Age, this lay elsewhere. And the late Ottoman centuries saw its village was the least successful of the group. It was also one of two to be abandoned before the 20th century. We must also imagine that some events and personalities, mostly lost to us, short-term history, histoire événementielle, in the annals scheme of historical time, lay behind some critical features in the history of this landscape. For example, the secondary status of Hietos in the Bronze Age to an alternative center to the west. Then again, the reverse, the emergence of Hietos to dominance in the early Iron Age. Another case of these events, these short-term events, was the actions of a local wealthy magnate in the late 17th century. Then finally, in the 19th century, divergent economies and arbitrary raids by bandits favored the abandonment of the villages of Vendry, Stavendra, and Ravon, and the population moved to the modern surviving villages of Lutsi and of Pavlo. The people of Pavlo, intriguingly, ignore the Greekness of the ancient city and have absorbed the monument into their own history, signposting it as the ancient citadel of Pavlos, their own Albanian origin village from the 14th century. When we were field walking the Hietos landscape, which is like a basin with wonderful acoustics in summer, there were very few people in the landscape, just some goats, but no farmers. In the silence, almost silence, the different field teams scattered across this landscape could hear each other talking in the distance. And sometimes in our imagination, we could almost hear the noise of the ancient city. We could see the smoke rising from its houses, hear the prayers from its Acropolis temples. And in the same collapse of time, we could place our feet in the ancient rock-cut staircase on the Acropolis. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, for giving us such a broad historical sweep and drawing it together in such an eloquent way. We're open for, is that? Not picking me up? Just, okay. We're open to questions. Can I kick off the questioning, John?
Yes, please.
You've given us a very sort of clear exposition of the sort of archaeological evidence. You haven't said anything about the changing environment here. Is this this basin one where we have a stable ecology through time? Do we have any evidence for how that's changing and interacting with this population cycles?
Yes, that's always a problem with large plains. And there are several plains in this area, and we were obviously worried that they might have changed their level through alluviation or colluviation. But this is a karst landscape. So in fact, they have almost no drainage at all visible. And if anything, the drainage is slightly going out of the karst basin to its edges. So luckily, we didn't have a problem, but we have material buried. And in fact, the archaeology stretches right across the surface of the plains, very fortunately. I think we'd have to go back a much earlier period to actually find differences to these dolinas. That was a great advantage, because that's always a worry with basins like this, that a lot of material is buried beneath. And also these hill soils, we don't seem to see any major loss because they're also largely subsurface drainage in limestone, so they don't have a risk of massive soil loss if it was a much more impenetrable surface.
Thanks. Questions?
Thank you. A couple of questions. The photograph we're looking at on the left, are those modern residences or warehouses or what?
They're solar panels.
Good, thank you.
It's actually the most profitable land use in Greece today is to put up solar panels compared to trying to grow crops. The market for olives is very unstable. And many people drink Greek wine. So, you know, in fact, and the tobacco's gone. When we first started work here, there were the villages were full of tobacco leaves, and that's gone down. So these are now actually the best way to make money is just to put these gigantic, and it's quite scary because they move with the sun. So you're walking through the field and you hear this sort of like a science fiction, and you turn around and these great big things are sort of following you. So it's quite a shock.
And the other thing I wanted to ask was these late modern landlords, are they Albanian or represent Greek takeover with the eviction of the Ottoman Empire, or Ottomans, or who?
Yes. I mean, initially...
It must be recorded. It's
the reason for the prosperity in the 16th century, apart from the fact that it is quite a prosperous period in many parts of Europe after the 14th century, is that the Ottoman regime had a very low tax basis. It allowed people to retain their faith, their churches, and they simply had to produce a certain amount to support a cavalryman. So each village had to support a cavalryman. That was quite a low cost. So they flourished and expanded in the 150 years. But then the state began to collapse, and these powerful local lords, who were both Greek, Albanian, and Ottoman Turkish, they all began to take over land, and the church as well, I'm afraid, began to take over, the Orthodox Church, to take over land and simply to absorb it, and a bit like the Scottish clans, you know, so it became, instead of public land shared by the group, it became private property. And these people then would pay the tax to the central government, probably lie about it and not give all the tax they should pay, and they became personally just great estates. And the great lucky clue for us was the church was also refurbished and handed over at the same time as the village. So we knew pretty well that we're dealing with something involving one of these wealthy individuals. And that's why we see the shift in the settlement pattern. So it was a major shift in power within the Ottoman Empire. A secondary feudalism almost, you might say. Yes.
Thank you very much. I suppose it's inevitable that we'll look at in such a long time span, we'll focus in on the periods that relate to us most closely. But I was especially struck by what seemed to be the most dramatic demographic change, which is the collapse of population at the end of the Roman period into the early Byzantine period. And my question is very simply, what happened then? What caused that massive collapse?
Yes. Well, there is the Justinianic plague, which a bit like the 14th century, there's some discussion, but I think in the countryside, you really see an extraordinary depopulation. I think something else which Martin knows all about is once the wealthy landowners, the villa owners, left for the capital, then a great deal of support and organization and security disappeared in the countryside. And in this case, in fact, the Slavic populations moved in the 7th century. And this area was lost to the Byzantine Empire. And it was occupied by Slavs. So some of the other village names, not these actually, are Slavic in origin. Not that that necessarily means that they were coming in and killing everybody, but simply there was a great sense of insecurity. But there is another problem, is that we don't know as much as we'd like to about the pottery of the 7th to 8th to 9th centuries. There are certain imports which are very classic if you find them for that period, and a growing number of scholars are identifying local products. But it's only with the 10th, 11th century when glazed wares become very popular, and then every student comes and fills their bags with hundreds and hundreds of beautiful glazed shirts, and you get a sort of feeling that suddenly something's happened dramatically, but we know much less about this period. So I show maps, we have got evidence for the early Byzantine period, which is the 7th on to the 9th centuries, at our village site of Sienpri. So we know the presence and a few other sites in that area, but just a few pieces. But then from those points, we see for sure when the glazed wares come in that they are the village sites which will grow. But the scale is very unclear. So we have to be very careful about saying how many people have disappeared, because actually we have of course, the Byzantine sources saying it's terrible, the Slavs have come, they're killing everybody and blah, blah, blah. And you don't know how bad that actually was and how much was actually affecting. And for sure, the rich left, but the peasants will have left and intermarried. So we know several sites where we can see this kind of continuity going on. The name changes to a Slav name, but we have the same place going on. This is different because everything is gone in the 14th century, except for a few sites.
Sorry.
I was very struck by the sort of environmental history aspects of what you were talking about at one point, probably because I've just been teaching a class on environmental history in 17th century America, which is a very different sort of field. But what are the heights of population on your table? You were talking about very intensive agriculture that was sort of exhausting the land. Now, what are they growing and why can't they do anything about it? So why are they not able to kind of sustain their own population during obviously that time of great flourishing of this civilization?
Yes. I mean, the basic crops will be wheat and barley, because the olive and the wine are not something you can consume yourself in great numbers, and it's something on a small scale. And then, as we saw with the Roman villas, it's something that you can make money by exporting it. So it mainly would be intensive cereal growing. And the problem is, I mean, our specialist Rob Shield has written a lot about this, and the problem is that before modern fertilizers, you cannot keep cropping at this scale year after year after year. The soil simply won't take it, and gradually the yields go down and down and down. In the Mediterranean environment, every 10 years there's a drought. You've got that to cope with as well. And we clearly see in the Hellenistic period a lot of sources for the shortage of food, importing from Cyrenaica and elsewhere to try and help various cities, or food moving from one city to another. But I think the population that I showed you, it's way beyond the modern period. So how on earth could they maintain this without modern fertilizers? And for clear, when you see this extraordinary amount of off-site pottery only in this period, no other period, then I think you see that this must almost certainly show that they had this habit, that they would actually try and take the city rubbish, because it's coming out of the city, into the fields to try to keep that fertility going. But that, again, won't last, because the same cycle, as Rob Shield has argued, you end up still sometime later with the problem that the soil simply won't keep on feeding that level of population. You've got to reduce that population. There are other things involving the Roman impact, which seems to have been pretty bad. I mean, they were destroying cities throughout Boeotia, and they're putting massive fines on them. There's a change in the support system within the cities as well. So I think The Republican impact was very negative here. And we suddenly see this wave of negotiatores, of money people coming in at this time of decline. So these hawks are coming in and seizing on these weak, depopulated landscapes. They're probably buying up land very cheap and lending money to the cities, which are very impoverished. And so I think, I'm afraid to say, in some landscapes, the Roman impact, Martin, is not as beneficial as it is in Britain, but in places like central Greece, as you see from the bigger picture of the decline of the cities, and the combination of an earlier overexpansion agriculturally and the impact of a certain form of Roman colonialism really had very bad effects on the Roman countryside over large parts of Greece, as it did in Sicily. You see something very similar going on in Sicily.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there another period that has been kind of exaggerated in the literary sources is the transition between the Byzantine period and the Frankish period, and especially when it comes to things like castles, etc., in the area. Is that reflected in the archaeological record? Or because from the population numbers that you presented, it seems to be no change at all, almost.
Yes, if I was talking about further south in the Peloponnese, the population tends to decline somewhat in the Crusader period, but the Peloponnese was disputed continually between the Byzantine and the Crusader authorities, who never really established themselves very well there. So it was a much more uncertain region. In our area, the Dukes of Athens and Thebes really had quite a stable situation. And what we see, basically, they simply take the existing Byzantine settlement pattern. And we first began to go into the Franks because this is a thing when you're a prehistorian, you often have to suddenly be aware of things, very large things in the landscape. And we were looking for traces of Bronze Age settlement and then classical farms. And there are these great towers, these Crusader towers everywhere. Eventually we thought we have to do something about these towers. And we got a historian, Peter Locke from York, who came and made a special study of our towers. And whenever we find a Crusader tower, we realize there's a Byzantine village which already existed. So what they did was they came in, the Duke said, go and find, I'll give you some villages, 1 or 2 villages each, and go and build a tower and just call out, and the people bring a few sheep and some corn every so often, and you just keep the peace, and when I have a war, you come with your men-at-arms. So the country is full of these Crusader sites, and at Thebes there's a beautiful great big palace where they had feasts and jousting, as it was on the Acropolis at Athens. And the country is full of these towers. And basically, they just took over the Byzantine system and were also fairly low tax, so it didn't suffer very much, so it was relatively prosperous. And so it's a very smooth transition. Ceramically, you can't tell the difference because the middle to late Byzantine ceramic are pretty well globalized, commercialized by now. So you actually can't tell the difference between a 1200 Byzantine village and a 1250 Crusader village, except for a few new imports which are going to both communities. So it's a very flowing transition. Incidentally, the Albanian arrival is just the same. We didn't notice that, in fact, our village had changed ethnicity because the pottery of the 14th and the 15th century is identical. So at our village site, it looked as if the same people were living there until we got the Ottoman maps and we saw that they disappeared and been replaced by John Vendre's people coming in. But ceramic-wise, you could not tell the difference between those periods. And that was quite a shock to us if we hadn't had the Ottoman records. But there are other reasons, which is actually that when we first came to Boeotia, the old people was talking Albanian in the cafes. And that, of course, was a surprise to us. We didn't know about that. We had Greek students coming from Athens who came to the villages and would sit in the cafes. And after a while, they'd say, who are these people to us? Because they had never been taught this. This is not part of Greek history. So they'd never been taught that there were these Arvanitic peoples living in the countryside who still use some of their language to today. But ceramic-wise, archaeologically, you wouldn't know that had happened, I'm afraid. It's a bit of a shock.
You probably explained this, but I probably missed it. But what techniques do you use to actually work out population levels?
I knew somebody would ask that difficult question. Yes. I've always said these figures are, I suggest these figures because, of course, There's only one point where there's 2 points where we're rather sure, which is from the classical period and this Hellenistic period, where we have certain texts which relate to the army size and the division of the Boeotian army, the Confederacy, into different city units. And we have the specific record on the Acropolis of how many young men reached the age of 18 who were citizens over a period of 60 years. So we have some fixed points where we can actually use those to check the archaeology, because we then independently look at the size of a city and we try to calculate the domestic part of a city, the kind of density of population. And then we look at the density of sites and try and work out how often they were replaced in the landscape. And from that, we build up a scale. And it looks fairly clear from the historic sources and the archaeology, for example, that the classical period is overpopulated. There's nothing like it even in 1981 or 1990. So they're relative figures. When I said 2,880, that's not to be taken as a real figure, but it's on the way to 3,000, and the carrying capacity is maybe 3,200, 3,300 from our geomorphologists and our soil scientists. So the main thing is the scale, that this is a level that can't be appreciated. But then the most important, interesting thing is that when you get to these low levels, these Ottoman period villages with very small populations, they're doing fine. And then you have to think, okay, I have to rethink when I show you these graphs. You don't read them in a simple way. You read them in a very different way. What is the conditions of life? What is the lifestyle like? What is the actual prosperity relative to the population? And then I think we have to start rethinking demography when you actually start at that level. Whereas we tend to think of the classical Greek period, the highest population, it's actually wonderful, they're building temples, this is great. Ever after that, it's decline. And of course it isn't. It's just a different way of life, a different pressure on the landscape. There's no reason to think that these villages don't have relatively good life. They certainly have fantastic social lives and complex customs of their own.
So I had 2 questions online. However, you've answered one during answering the other questions about villagers speaking Albanian, and that's surprising, this commenter, when they worked in the same place but a different area in the 60s. But the first question I have is, what, if anything, might you have missed by not conducting excavations?
Yeah, this is always a problem. Let me put it this way. We were able to survey this landscape and the city of 16 hectares. The city we did in 2 summers of a month with a small team. Now another team, Dutch team, working in a city called Hyettos, north of us, in 6 years, dug 7 houses. And this is necessary, but we understand what the houses are like and the size of population. But I've rather specialized in doing the whole city. And then we can use these windows to talk about what's inside the city likely to be like, the size of the house, how many people might have lived there, and the ceramics. We get more information from excavation. But I suppose I've specialized in actually doing whole cities in a couple of years, and many cities, because we need to compare this. And there is a risk 7 houses perhaps is important as windows, but it can't tell you a great deal about the city as a whole. So I think I've made that decision really. Also in Greece, you have to buy the land if you want to excavate, and then you have to probably have a structure that you pay for where the finds are stored, and it goes on. So it's a very complicated procedure to excavate in Greece, and you can't easily mix what we do with that kind of activity. And of course, nowadays, you have to have so many specializations to do it properly. Soil scientists and all sorts of extra techniques. You can't just dig a hole and pull out the pottery and do a few animal bones, but you really need to spend a lot of money and time to do this. And even the 7 houses, as you see, they did it very well, but it took that long to do 7 houses because they did all the things you should do. And it does mean we often can't say a lot about the whole city. So I think I made a decision that what I do is complementary. Martin, I think, has managed to do both, which is even more impressive. Perhaps Martin could also say something about that. Yes.
I was very interested about in your latest remark about the acoustic landscape. And
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, based on your experience, how stable is this? How much does it get affected by weather conditions and things like that? And is this something that could be taken into account in the development of defensive networks and things like that? Or do you think it's something that it is, very circumstantial?
Yes, it is circumstantial. There are defensive networks, and they involve towers on high points which communicated by flashing from swords or from fires at night. And this whole Boeotian landscape has a classical watchtower system on high points which are indivisible. Interestingly, the Crusaders didn't care about that. All their towers are in low positions. They were just sitting there eating their beef and shouting out to the villagers, and they were not really very sensible about keeping in touch with each other. But the acoustic, I think, is a peculiar phenomenon. We tried the same test in Thespiae, and actually the sound and the visibility doesn't exist. This is a basin, as you can see here. So it actually was something we just noticed, but those people would have had a very close link to the city. And they are mostly commuter farmers. So most of the farmers working in this landscape lived in the city, 71% we calculate. So when you're out in that landscape, you were literally in visual and audio contact with the city. And it would have created an intense feeling of belonging, because most people lived in the city because they love the political, the social life, very different from a Roman city, which is maybe 15, 20% urbanized, generally in the empire. As far as we've calculated recently on a European project, this is 70 to 80%. So the belonging to the city is such a different thing in the Greek city-state world, as opposed to living in the way you link to a Roman city, in which 15 to 20%, which is a pre-industrial norm. In pre-industrial times, 15 to 20% is typical urbanization. So this thing about the city with 70, 80%, the extraordinary sense of belonging, it's very internalized society, which is why they fight each other all the time. Even little Hietos takes big Thebes in a battle, loses, of course, but it's fair. Well, we've got the case at the moment this week of a small state taking on a gigantic state heroically. So they would do that at the smallest levels.
John, you've given some very full answers that demonstrate just how broad and deep this subject is and your work on it. So can we thank you again for a splendid lecture?
Thank you very much for coming and listening to me.
I give notice the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 17th March, 5 p.m, and we will hear a paper, Cities, Towns and Villages, living in the diverse environments of the Indus civilization by Dr. Cameron Petrie. The meeting stands adjourned. There are some drinks outside.